Today, we're diving into a Supreme Court case that answers a really fundamental question. When a crime happens, how far do the ripples of justice actually extend? You'll see that the answer, found in Holmes versus SIPC, draws a super sharp line that decides who gets their day in court and who gets left out. Okay, let's start with a scenario. Imagine a CEO commits some massive fraud. The company is obviously a victim, but what about the shareholders who lost all their savings, or the employees who suddenly lost their jobs? How about the suppliers who just lost a huge client? Who, out of all those people, actually gets to sue the CEO for damages? This question, where do you draw the line, is the puzzle at the very heart of this explainer. So here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the powerful law that's at the center of this whole thing. Then we'll get into the crime itself. After that, we'll untangle the core legal puzzle, see how the Supreme Court solved it, and finally, we'll talk about why this decision from 1992 still matters so much today. First up, let's talk about the law at the center of this case, RICO. You've probably heard of it in movies, right? The law they use to take down mob bosses. But its real power and its reach is so much wider than you might think. The Racketeer Influenced in Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO for short, is a legal powerhouse. On one hand, it's a criminal law that lets prosecutors go after patterns of illegal activity. But, and this is key, it also has a civil side. That means private parties, regular people or corporations, can use it to sue for damages. And it's that civil side that's so important in our case. All right, now let's get to the story itself. Like a lot of these big legal dramas, this one starts with a crime. And you guessed it, a whole lot of financial damage. So here's what went down. A group of conspirators, led by a guy named Robert Holmes, started manipulating the prices of several stocks. Their scheme directly caused 2 stock brokerage firms to just go bankrupt. All of a sudden, these firms couldn't pay back their own customers, leaving them completely high and dry. And this is where a really important player comes into the picture. The Securities Investor Protection Corporation, or SIPC. You can kind of think of them like an insurance fund for investors. They are legally required to step in and pay back customers when a brokerage firm fails. So SIPC paid out almost $13 million to cover the losses. And to get that money back, they turned around and sued Holmes and his crew under the Civil RICO Act. Now, this lawsuit brings us to the core legal question of the whole case, a concept called proximate cause. It's basically asking, were you hit directly by the crime, or were you just hit by the shrapnel? Proximate cause is everything here. It doesn't just ask if you were harmed, but if you were harmed directly enough for the law to actually step in. It's the legal system's way of drawing a line to stop lawsuits from stretching on forever down a long, long chain of consequences. Think of it like a line of dominoes. The schemers pushed the very first one. That was the stock fraud. The brokerage firms were the first to fall over. That's a direct injury. But SIPC? They weren't hit by that initial push at all. They were way down the line. They were only harmed because the brokerage firms fell and because they were legally obligated to pay the customers. Their injury was clearly indirect, and this chain of events really illustrates it perfectly. Step 1 is the crime. Step 2 is the direct harm. But look, SIPC doesn't even show up until step 4, way after the broker-dealers collapsed and their customers lost money. So the question for the court was, can someone at step 4 sue the people all the way back at step 1? So all of this led to the final showdown. The case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, which had to decide once and for all where to draw the line for these civil RICO cases. And here it is, the key language from their 1992 decision. The court said that just being a but-for cause, meaning but for the crime I wouldn't have been hurt, well, that's not enough. Your injury had to be the proximate cause. And they defined that as needing, quote, some direct relation between the injury asserted and the injurious conduct alleged. So, what does all that legal jargon actually mean? Let's bring back our domino analogy, because the Supreme Court's ruling is crystal clear. They said SIPC could not sue. Why? Because SIPC wasn't the first domino, the brokerage firms were. Since SIPC's injury was indirect, just a ripple effect from the direct harm to someone else, they didn't have the right to sue under RICO. Simple as that. So the court drew a really clear line in the sand. But why does this one decision still have such a big impact on our legal system and even the business world today? Well, the consequences are huge. By making sure that only direct victims can sue under civil RICO, the court basically prevented a chaotic flood of lawsuits from anyone and everyone who was indirectly affected by a crime. This ruling gives lower courts a clear, predictable standard to follow, and it protects defendants from being held liable for a potentially infinite chain reaction of damages. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The Supreme Court chose order and predictability over a wider net of justice. They drew a bright line to stop legal chaos from taking over. But does that line really create a more stable system, or does it, in the end, let some wrongdoers off the hook for the full, far-reaching impact of the harm they cause? Definitely something to think about.